Hello everyone, welcome back. I'm teacher Sarah. In today's video, let's learn about modal verbs. So today let's talk about three modal verbs. Today we will look at the modal verbs should, ought or ought to, and must. These words are used in many different ways. We can use these words to talk about duty and obligation. Obligation is something that you have to do. If you have an obligation, it means no choice, you have to do it. So we can use these words to talk about things we have to do. We can use these words to give advice and to say what we think is right for people to do or about what people have done, our opinion about what people have done if we think it is right. So let's take a look at the many different ways we can use these terms. First, let's look at should and ought. These two verbs are very similar and can often replace each other. This means most of the time, if I use the word should, I can also just replace it with the word ought or ought to. Although in English, should is used much more often than ought. So if the word ought confuses you or you don't use it very often, that's okay. You can use should in place of it. So let's take a look at some examples of how we can use should and ought to interchangeably, or some examples that show that we can use these words in just the same way. First example, you should see Star Wars. It's a great series. Or, you ought to see Star Wars. It's a great series. So here I'm telling you, I think it's a good idea for you to see Star Wars. I think you should do it. I think you ought to do it. Same meaning. Here's another example. You should join us. You ought to join us. So here I'm suggesting or saying that it's a good idea. Come on, you should join us. You ought to join us. So we can see in these two examples that we can use should and ought to in very much the same way. Let's look at another way should and ought can be used. Should and ought are also used to talk about logical probability. What is logical probability? This means something that is most likely true. If I think about it, it's probably true. So let's take a look at an example. I bought 2 pizzas. That should be enough. I bought 2 pizzas. That ought to be enough. So let's say I'm having some friends over and I decide to order some pizzas. I think most definitely, right? Really, most probably that 2 pizzas will be enough for all of my friends. So I could say, that should be enough, or that ought to be enough. Not quite the same as saying that is enough. Maybe, right? There's a tiny chance. Maybe we'll eat 2 pizzas and we still want more, but I look around and I think, that should be enough. That ought to be enough. Let's see another example. Let's say I am waiting for my friend Jack to come over and finally I hear a knock on the door. Oh, that should be Jack knocking on the door. Or that ought to be Jack knocking on the door. So I was expecting him. If someone comes and knocks on my door, it is most likely, most probably Jack, right? I'm expecting him. There's a small chance that maybe it's the postman, or maybe it's someone else, but most probably it's Jack. That ought to be Jack. So here we see we can use should and ought to talk about logical probability or something that is most likely true. Okay, next let's talk about the modal verb must. Must has similar meanings to should and ought, but is stronger and more definite. So let's take a look at some examples. Here's sentence number 1. The doctor said I must give up smoking. This is an order. If your doctor says you must give up smoking, it means you must. You have no choice. You are obligated to do it. You have to do it. It is an order. You must. Whereas if we used should or ought to here, you really ought to give up smoking. This is just a suggestion or some advice. It is not someone telling you what to do. It's just a suggestion. So we can see that must is a much stronger word. Let's see another example of how must is stronger than should and ought. If I say, Ada must be home now, that means I'm sure she's home. Maybe Ada is my daughter, and I told her to be home by 7 p.m. If it's 7:30, I could say, Ada must be home now. It means I'm sure she's home. I told her to be there. She must be there. This is very definite, right? I'm very positive, very sure that she's there. Maybe if it's only 6:30 or 6:45, though, I could say, Ada should be home now. Right? I think she's home. She should be. She might be, but I'm not as sure. So must is used when we are sure or something is definite or it's in order. So let's expand. What we've talked about so far are the most common and most simple and frequent uses of these verbs. So let's expand and see some other, maybe more challenging ways that we use these terms in English. Should can be used instead of must to make orders and instructions more polite. This is very common for businesses when they are telling their customers to do something, or even when teachers are telling their students to do something, they might use should instead of must or have to be more polite. For example, this form should be filled out in ink. Okay, well, you really have to fill it out in ink or they'll make you do it again, but by using the word should, it sounds more polite. Here's a similar example. Applications should be sent by May 31st. Well, you must send them by May 31st or it won't be accepted. But to be more polite, they should be sent by May 31st. So we can use should to make our instructions or orders a little more polite. Here's another expansion for the words should and ought. Should and ought can be used for predictions, but not must. So a prediction is when we are guessing what will happen, right? So for example, I could say, the weather should be fine tomorrow, or the weather ought to be fine tomorrow. I'm predicting, I'm guessing. Weather is a little unpredictable. Maybe it will rain. We don't know. We think we're sure, but not totally positive. So I could say the weather should be fine tomorrow. Let's go camping. The weather ought to be fine tomorrow. Let's go for a picnic. But I cannot use must. I would not say the weather must be fine tomorrow because I can't tell the weather what to do, right? I can't tell the future what to do. So when we're talking about the future and making predictions, we can just use should and ought. All right, we have one more, also about should and ought. As you see, there are so many uses for these words. This is the last one we'll talk about today. Should and ought can be used to talk about unfulfilled obligations in the past. So things that didn't happen, but you should have done in the past. And again, we cannot use must because it has already happened. So for example, let's say I'm talking to my friend. She goes on a date with a guy and it doesn't go well. She tells me about it. I might say, you should have been nicer to him. So I'm saying this is something you should have done in the past. You should have been nicer to him. I think this is how you should have changed your behavior, right? You ought to have come to the meeting. So you really kind of needed to come to the meeting, but you didn't. Maybe you missed a lot of information. Oh, you ought to have come to the meeting, right? So here we can also use should and ought to talk about things that didn't happen in the past that you should have done. But again, we cannot use must, because must means it hasn't happened yet, right? If I'm telling you to do something, you must be nicer to him. It means it hasn't happened yet. It didn't happen in the past, and I'm not predicting the future. We can only use must in that very particular way. So be careful when you're using these kinds of sentences.